in 12, 18 months, whatever that time frame might be, what do we want to have achieved so that when we show up for our next financing to accelerate our next round of growth, that we'll have proved in those last 18 months? And for us, that story for the Series B is not only can we start scaling this business, but there is repeatability and that there is engagement.
Welcome to How to Raise a Round, Carta's podcast about one of the most challenging elements of every startup founder's journey, raising money. Each episode, we sit down with new and veteran founders to hear the stories behind their funding rounds and learn about the challenges, advice, and unexpected lessons they learned along the way. I'm Josh Durst-Wiseman, manager of branded content at Carta and host of How to Raise a Round. Our guest this week is Shaan Hathiramani, founder and CEO of Flockjay, a bootcamp that provides entry-level access to the tech industry for underrepresented groups. In the summer of 2020, Flockjay raised a Series A of $11 million in anticipation of scaling their staff, hitting key growth milestones, and paving the way for a successful Series B in the future. However, as with a lot of the founders we'll talk to this season, Shaan's original plan for fundraising was stopped dead in its tracks when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Today, Shaan tells us how the COVID-19 shutdown allowed him to reframe his thinking around how to pitch his company to investors. With socioeconomic inequality suddenly taking the national spotlight, he saw an opportunity to reframe some of his personal values into real points of strength that he could leverage when raising funds. Shaan founded Flockjay in 2018 with the goal of providing opportunities for people from underrepresented groups to break into the tech industry through this new kind of online curriculum.
We're an online sales academy, and we empower job seekers from all backgrounds to get the skills, the connections, and the community needed to break into tech and launch a career accessing upward mobility.
Shaan closed a $3 million seed round in October of 2019. At the top of 2020, it was time to get started on his planning for raising Flockjay's Series A.
So the calendar turned and it was January 2020. And we had all of this unbridled optimism for the trajectory of our business. We were relatively fresh off of our seed round in March of 2019. We were graduates from Y Combinator's program in the prior winter. And we felt really good about running.
Shaan planned to raise his next round in a year. As he began thinking about how to plan for it, he found two key points that he wanted to address. First, he needed to prove that Flockjay was capable of scaling to a university-sized school.
My intention was to prove the hypothesis of, can we actually train people entirely online to acquire skills in tech and in sales? And would companies pay for access to that incredibly top-performing talent?
The second driver of Shaan's Series A had him looking even further ahead.
As we approached our Series A, the next milestone for us was, how do we demonstrate that we can grow this business, scale this business, operationalize this business, and really broaden access and impact for our core mission, which is empowering upward mobility for a much broader audience and really building deep relationships with partner companies who saw the value in top performing sales reps from diverse backgrounds.
With this round, he was about to construct the narrative that would tee up a successful Series B in the future.
One of the things I quickly learned as a founder is that you're always in some kind of fundraising mindset, and you're always thinking about how do you build a long-term sustainable business. Part of that is building the next phase of growth while you're in the current one. And that next phase of growth is the story that you want to tell to that next round of investors who will help accelerate that chapter of growth. And so for us, the Series A was all about writing that story of scale.
Everything was on track for a smooth Series A fundraise a year in the future. And then, March 2020 happened.
The world changed. We went through a global pandemic, and all of a sudden, every company, whether you were in tech or not, had to fundamentally and existentially question their purpose and value as a business.
Shaan had a problem. He was running a training boot camp for tech salespeople in a moment when nobody was buying, selling, or most importantly, hiring. Almost out of nowhere, the luxury of time evaporated, and suddenly, Shaan was no longer thinking about how to raise a Series A in a year. He was thinking about how to keep Flockjay alive through next week.
I remember very vividly talking the company through what our temporary remote work policy would be like. Overnight, we became a fully remote and distributed company. And overnight, we saw the demand for hiring across the industry go to zero, which is just one of the things you wouldn't really wish upon yourself as you contemplate a potential fundraise situation. We were quite literally just trying to make it to the next week and the next day and figure out what was the core group of people at the company who could enable us to live to die another day.
Shaan had to abandon his original plan and devise a whole new one. Not only did his investor pitch have to change, his entire company had to adapt and meet this critical moment in order to survive.
The problem that we were having at that exact moment was the problem that every single other company was having at this moment. Whenever there is a disaster, your first instinct is to button down the hatches, but there's always an opportunity in that rubble. I started to realize a couple of really important, energizing things. One, the world that we had imagined in terms of an audience who might be seeking reskilling from their existing job without upward mobility, or folks who had been left behind in the movement towards tech and automation, there would be an influx of those people who'd be turning to and counting on programs like Flockjay to support them in this time. And our core audience is the frontline worker who now had the opportunity to turn to a program like Flockjay and future-proof themselves.
Just like that, Shaan had discovered the key element to raising a successful round during a period defined by uncertainty: focus on the target demographic. And Flockjay's target demo was the frontline worker.
The second thing we realized is that every company was going through the exact same motion of how do we keep the lights on and how do we lean into growth opportunities. A lot of software and software-enabled businesses saw their business start to pick up. And with that, there was a tremendous opportunity for us because those companies needed to hire quite a lot to keep growing. So the premium for trained, top-performing, elite sales talent, if anything, went up, not down. Suddenly, we had this influx of people who were ready, willing, and eager to reskill and break into tech, but we didn't necessarily have the support on the other side to catch them and connect them with companies who wanted to hire.
With this sudden influx of service workers who would be seeking the opportunity to now find another line of work, Shaan realized that this is exactly what Flockjay is all about: opening up opportunities for underrepresented groups to find their footing in a new industry. He'd been adamant about never compromising this value system from day one, and now, with the world changing, he'd use those exact values to carry Flockjay through something he never expected. Shaan wasn't going to wait a year to raise his Series A. He was going to do it right now, in the middle of a global crisis.
The third thing we realized was remote work became a thing. And now we could train anyone and support them getting a job anywhere. And that was really freaking cool. The last thing, and perhaps the most important thing to this story, is that as an industry and as a country, just as we were all going through a global pandemic, there was a reckoning for issues of economic and social justice. All of us were faced with the harsh reality of the fact that upward mobility was not universally accessible, that talent, while equally distributed, contrasted deeply with opportunity, which was not. And every single company, founder, CEO, business leader had to grapple with the fact that if they wanted to survive and thrive and attract the best talent and build an authentic culture, that they would have to really look inward and ask themselves what kind of company they wanted to be. Were they thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
Shaan was set on leveraging the moment to create the best possible outcome for Flockjay and its potential customers. He put the pressure to succeed on his own shoulders, knowing that there were now more people who could benefit from Flockjay than ever before.
One of the things that I remember most vividly is the heaviness and the weight of others who I had recruited personally to join me on this journey, on this project, who were looking to me not only for their paycheck or their livelihood or whether or not Flockjay would exist, but for clarity and hope and calm and reassurance in a way that extended beyond the scope of just Flockjay the business. And this was something I am passionate about, which is empowering others to do something ambitious, do something that makes a difference, and do something which allows us to feel we have purpose. And so, as like a guy running a tiny startup in the second floor of a ratty walk up in FiDi in San Francisco, that is what was swirling all around me. If I could prove that this fundraise in this world could work, then I was fundamentally proving that our entire business could work.
With this new perspective, Shaan officially decided to overhaul his original plan to raise in winter of 2021. Although founders rarely raise funds during the summer, he decided to take the leap. Now, it's worth noting that even in normal circumstances, Shaan's raise was outside of the typical fundraising calendar for startups. Most years, VCs take August and December off, or take on less work during those months, meaning that it's usually better to start your fundraise at the beginning of the year so that it can wrap up before August. However, the pandemic changed this typical schedule as vacation time was now essentially out of the picture. While Shaan's fundraising timeline was atypical, he was executing his plan during a period in which unconventional raises just might work to his advantage.
What I realized is that life only gives you one or two real moments to step up, and that I only had one chance to build Flockjay. We start this process, and like any good fundraise, it comes with a healthy dollop of rejection. And part of that equation is that our business, while it is accelerating, is also pretty ambitious. It doesn't fit neatly into the category of a SaaS business today or a marketplace business today. And lots of investors will like to compare you to the big flashy thing that you might be the next of. A funny anecdote on this is that when we were raising our seed, income share agreements, they were wonderful.
An income share agreement, or ISA, is a progressive alternative to the traditional loan. In this instance, it allows Flockjay to offer their services for free today and collect later once the client actually finds work. This model's a staple of coding and sales bootcamp programs. Customers don't have to pay for their classes until they actually get hired, which makes the programs more stable and lower risk for their customers. However,
fast forward a year plus later, and we're raising our Series A, our business, independent, growing, healthy, all of a sudden that narrative changed to, that shiny thing we loved last year? Don't think it's so hot this year. In fact, they're a dumpster fire.
Even though ISAs were all the rage in 2019, in 2020 they fell out of favor with investors, meaning that Shaan suddenly had yet another challenge to reckon with during his raise.
There are controllables and there are non-controllables. And part of what your responsibility is as a founder is to run your process and to really think about intentionally who aligns with the vision and the company you want to build and who recognizes that it isn't just a comparison to some shiny thing of the moment. We started actually getting these offers and started getting these interests. And I kind of pumped the brakes. I was like, hey, you want us to be this, and we don't want to be that. Or you want us to be that, and we don't want to be that. And the interesting part of that experience is that as a founder, it is very tempting to just take the money. But as we got to these later and later stages with folks, this was much bigger than just the money in the bank. This was an extremely core part of who we were as a company, what our values are, and by consequence, how successful we were going to be, because it was these precise moments that would impact the kind of business we wanted to build. So at that moment, I really started to think about more deeply, how did I want to show up in these meetings? What were the parts of our story that we really wanted to highlight? Up until now, we had focused a lot on what is the ROI for a company hiring from Flockjay? What is the potential benefit for tech sales as a profession to keep growing and for us to be a key part of that?
The ROI, or return on investment, for companies hiring from Flockjay was obviously essential for Shaan to define, but he soon came to the conclusion that Flockjay was being driven by something a little more abstract and meaningful than just its metrics.
Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging was always a part of that story, but it was something that was wrapped around the edges, even though from a values perspective, it is core. It is at the center of what we do. As the world is changing and as the events of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd were happening, I had this fire that just ignited in me. I was like, no, we're not going to take this money, and we're going to be really thoughtful about who we want to be at the table.
Now, obviously, refusing any offer might have seemed like a financial sacrifice for Flockjay in the moment, but Shaan knew that prioritizing the outcomes that he wanted for Flockjay would be a lot more important in the long run. Creating something truly inclusive was his highest priority, and achieving that goal meant being extremely selective about who his actual investors would be.
A core part of our business is partnering with companies who are looking to hire sales reps. And I think all of us at some level are aware of the fact that issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging oftentimes are looked at as targets that companies want to or aspire to hit. I think that comes from a place in tech of wanting to optimize and create some kind of outcome. And fundraising is no different. I realized that as the founder and CEO, I have a clear vision for what Flockjay can and will be. And the values are what will make or break this company. We have to reflect those values at every level of the business so that the output is the thing we want to see in the world. And those inputs to drive that output is who shows up on our cap table, how we approach our own hiring decisions, how we approach our own admissions process, how we do training empathetically, how we get people through this time from a mental health and wellness perspective.
With this new perspective on fundraising at the top of his mind, Shaan pulled together a pitch deck that reflected his output goals in an attempt to attract investors that were compatible with Flockjay.
I'm very grateful for one of our investors and advisors. I remember very clearly giving a practice run through of our deck with them. And her response was, hey, numbers look great, storyline seems reasonable, but where are you in this presentation? I didn't hear the Shaan that I know and that is embodied and lives and breathes this company. And that is what I really took to heart and that I really learned from, and went back to the drawing board, redid elements of our pitch, and then went back out there to specifically find the folks who would align with what we wanted to see in the world.
The moment had arrived. With his revised pitch ready to go, it was time for Shaan to pull together his board of directors.
The Series A is usually the point in which you're forming a formal board of directors for the first time. And when that happens, you go from being the only one who's a part of company impacting strategic decisions to making them in a committee. And the best and ideal state, at least the one that we were passionate about, was to have thoughtful, helpful, supportive folks in that room who would be aligned with our company's success, but who wouldn't be able to unilaterally control the direction of the company by having a majority of the seats. And that, at a high level, is how voting members of a board work. And then there are board observers who are able to still be in the room and contribute to that discussion, but don't necessarily have that voting agency that would help or hinder what you want to accomplish as a CEO.
And when structuring a board, it's important to consider the differences between the different roles of your board members. The typical board is structured with both observers and directors, and they both have unique roles within the actual board itself. A director has voting rights, where an observer, on the other hand, sits in the room and attends meetings, but they don't vote. This person's often a partner in the VC firm. They can also be a principal or outside counsel.
Whoever joins your cap table, it is like a marriage. They are part of the fabric of your company and will be so long as it continues to exist in the world. But something that's really important for me and for the company was retaining that clarity of vision and control and keeping the board structure simple and aligned with the kind of company that we want to build. So board control and board representation became very important. Specifically, having people in the room with cognitive and identity diversity.
Now, this is an important little note to mention. For most founders, it's pretty common to set your own shares on a vesting schedule when you found the company. However, this process can be disrupted when you raise your Series A because your investors might ask you to unvest some or even all of your shares in order to align your incentives with theirs. This was something that Shaan had to take into consideration among countless other details when he was assembling his board.
I remember when I first started the process and was writing this memo, I thought, wow, this is the world that will exist when Flockjay is everywhere. Midway through this process, when I was going through this step back and what do we really want to do moment, I said, this describes a world that might exist one day, but doesn't really demonstrate how we get there and doesn't really set those different stages of growth. And the way I thought about it is that memo is basically what the moon looks like once you've landed your rocket. And what was important to me was to demonstrate, okay, what does that journey look like? From liftoff at the seed stage to dropping the first boosters, to turning on the next booster, to clearing the atmosphere. Each of those steps were really important to communicate, not just to investors, but frankly, to the company as well.
Now, Shaan raises a great point here about how to choose your lead investor if you're lucky enough to do so. When choosing your lead, there are a few key ingredients that you'll want to consider. The first, and coincidentally the most important for Shaan, is that their core values should align with yours. Your lead investor will set the tone for your raise and have a big impact on the future journey of your company, and thus their values will set the example for other investors to follow. And in that spirit, another point to consider is how well you get along with your potential lead on a personal level. As Shaan mentioned earlier, a founder-investor relationship can be compared to a marriage. Shaan landed on Headline, a fund from San Francisco, as his lead investor because they were compatible in every way that mattered. His next investor ended up being someone he had connected with a year and a half prior to his raise.
Rounds are funny how they all come together in the end, and there's no scientific way for how things happen to fall into place. And if anything, it underscores the importance of human relationships and coming at things from an authentic and genuine place. 2019 winter, raising our seed round, Cotu is one of our investors. One of their in-house PR and comms leaders and I hit it off. And we kept in touch. And one thing led to another in this round. And I actually emailed her back, said, hey, Natalie, I'd love to have you in the round. She was like, that's amazing. Yes, I'm in. And I'm doing this really cool project with Gabrielle Union on her brand. Like, do you want to meet her? I think she would absolutely love what you're doing. And I was like, yes, that would be amazing.
Often when raising funds, nothing will fall into place until suddenly everything does. That's what happened to Flockjay. By finding investors that understood Flockjay's end goal and shared Shaan's values, Shaan was able to build a network of other investors through warm introductions from his current ones.
Within 48 hours, I was on a Zoom with Gabrielle Union, and it was one of the more surreal conversations I've had. Gabby is incredibly thoughtful and kind and generous, and I was obviously sweating bullets and walking through who we were and what we're doing, and my personal story on how I came to start Flockjay, having spent some time teaching financial literacy on the side. And it's funny because that one little anecdote was the thing that struck the chord with Gabby. And she was like, financial literacy is a skill we still think about with our kids, and is something that is part of a broader story of empowerment that I feel really passionate about. And what you're doing at Flockjay on the sales side is really special. And your business is great, but frankly, I just connected with you. And I have one question for you, which is, how can I support you and your business? And that's how that happened. That's wild. That's the crazy world of startups. And there is nothing transactional, about this business. It is all about coming from a place of authenticity, of really doing the work, of investing in other people. Salesforce and Mark Benioff joined the table because not only do they do incredible work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, they also profoundly care about having more and better sales reps in the world. So that's how things started to come together really quickly in the end. And I could not be more proud and more grateful to be working with the partners that we have today.
In the end, Flockjay raised $11 million in their Series A from 10 different investors, including some big names like Salesforce Ventures, Lightspeed, Headline, Clio Capital, and even Microsoft chairman John Thompson. They also added Impact America Fund to their cap table, which not only invests in companies that serve excluded groups, but actually requires every founder to sign a pledge that attests to them building values into their corporate governance. From open to close, the whole raise took about 3 months. Shaan's raise was motivated by a desire to open up the tech industry to underrepresented groups. However, what he did differently was a matter of inputs and outputs. Instead of inputting his core values into an equation to achieve certain metric results like revenue, Shaan instead designed a company where his core values were the actual outputs. This made decision-making a whole lot simpler. At every decision point during his Series A, Shaan was able to ask himself, would saying yes to this bring Flockjay closer to achieving our core values?
At the Series A stage, most businesses are still an empty canvas. And you can either be the painter or be painted on.
Next time on How to Raise a Round.
One of the big things about accelerator programs is the concept of being able to connect with a lot of investors at one time to create momentum for a fundraise, where you're meeting a bunch of people left and right, FOMO gets created. All of those sort of tropes, if you will, around fundraising work.
We sit down with Laura Wittig, founder and CEO of Brightly, to learn the story behind the $1 million priced round she raised for her pre-seed. We'll learn that part of raising money is being flexible in order to find the terms and partners that fit your business the best. This podcast is presented by eShares Incorporated, doing business as Carta, Carta Incorporated, and Carta Ventures. The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not reflect the view of eShares Incorporated, doing business as Carta, Carta Incorporated, and Carta Ventures. Listeners should not treat any opinions or comments as investment, financial, legal, accounting, or tax advice. The content of the podcast is not legal, financial, or tax advice and is not meant to recommend or offer the purchase or sale of a security. This podcast is informational only. How to Raise a Round is a Hitstart Media production. The show is written and co-produced by me, Josh Durst-Wiseman. Hitstart Media founder Theo Miller is creative director. Olivia Laurie is production manager, with sound production by Nick Canepa and script production by Mary Kelleher. This podcast is presented by eShares Inc., doing business as Carta Inc., Carta, and Carta Ventures.